I would like to start by thanking the director, Santanu Chowdhury, for inviting me to give this convocation address. I've never given a convocation address before, so I'm not quite sure what's expected of me, but what I'm going to do is talk about the interaction between reason and intuition. I'm going to start by talking about something Darwin said in his book, The Voyage of the Beagle. On that voyage, Darwin visited numerous coral islands, and he noted that there were three types of coral island. There's coral islands with a reef close to the island. There's coral islands with a barrier reef that's a long way from the island, like a mile offshore. And there's coral islands that are just atolls with a ring of barrier reef and no island in the middle. Because he was a biologist, Darwin noticed that there was a problem with this. The barrier reefs were in deep water, more than 100 feet deep, and the live coral reef that reached the surface of the ocean was built on top of a big pile of dead coral. And the question was, how did that dead coral get there? Because coral can't grow more than about 100 feet below the surface. There isn't enough light. After some thought, Darwin realized what must have happened. It started off as a coral island with just a fringe of reef around it. And then both the island and the ocean floor sank. And as they sank, the reef got further from the island, and new coral was built on top of the old coral. So just from visiting these coral islands and doing some reasoning, Darwin was able to overcome the fundamental intuition that the Earth is rigid. Darwin even postulated that the Great Barrier Reef off the coast of Australia was caused by the whole Australian continental shelf sinking. About 80 years later, someone called Alfred Wegener postulated the theory of continental drift, which was even more radical. That, for example, South America had once been attached to Africa, and they drifted apart, opening up the Atlantic Ocean. Geologists mocked this theory as wishful thinking, even though Wegener, who wasn't a geologist, he was a climatologist, had lots of evidence in favour of it. Lots of little paradoxes that could only be explained by continental drift. For example, the soil types along the coast of Europe and Africa matched up with the soil types along the coast of the Americas. Also, rare fossils that only occurred in certain parts of the coast of Africa matched up with the same rare fossils on the corresponding parts of the coast of South America. There were glacial scrapes in rocks in the tropics in Africa. That is, the kind of scrapes that are made by a glacier pulling a big rock over the top of a rock formation. So areas that were now in the tropics used to be covered in ice. There are also coal deposits in the Arctic, and the coal deposits are formed from plants that only grow in hot climates. So presumably, areas that are now in the Arctic used to be much hotter. Despite this evidence, the geologists were unconvinced. In fact, they were very strongly against Wegener's theory. They treated it as heresy. They said things like, if Wegener is right, the last 70 years of geology were a complete waste of time. They also said this theory should not be allowed in the textbooks, it will just confuse students. When David Attenborough was a student in the 1940s, he asked his lecturer about the theory of continental drift, and here's what the lecturer said. I once asked my lecturers why he was not talking to us about continental drift, and I was told sneeringly that if I could prove there was a force that could move continents, then he might think about it. The idea was moonshine, I was informed. Now what's interesting is, by the 1940s, people already had the correct mechanism for continental drift. It was proposed by Holmes in the 1930s, and it was that the continents floated on a sea of hot magma. When I was a boy in the 1950s, I listened to a radio program before the theory of continental drift was accepted, and in that radio program, there was some very strong biological evidence in favour of continental drift. There's a genus of water beetles, called the Elmidae, that live in fast-running streams and can't fly. If you look on the north coast of Australia, this genus has differentiated into a number of species which are in different streams on the north coast of Australia. And in about 100 million years, these species are so bad at migrating that they haven't managed to cross the mountain ridge between two streams. And yet, if you look at the north coast of New Guinea, you find the same species of Elmidae in the same order, but actually in reverse order. Now this is a weird paradox that needs some explaining. And the only explanation that makes any sense is that the north coast of New Guinea was once attached to the north coast of Australia, and it came off and turned around. The geologist's response to this argument was, how could beetles move continents? There's something fundamental here about doing science, which is, if you come across a paradox, you oughtn't to dismiss it. You don't want to jump to simplistic explanations of it, but you must bear it in mind. For a good scientist, a paradox is an irritant, and it never ceases to be irritating until the scientist can explain it. A paradox for a scientist is a bit like a piece of grit in an oyster. It irritates the oyster until the oyster has constructed a pearl to stop it being irritating. The reason I spent so long talking about the paradigm clash in geology between people who viewed the Earth as rigid and people who viewed the Earth as fluid, but at a much longer timescale, is that a very similar clash of paradigms happened in artificial intelligence. In the early days of artificial intelligence, in the 1950s, there were two quite different paradigms for how to build an intelligent system. One paradigm was inspired by logic. In the logic-inspired approach, the essence of intelligence is using symbolic rules to manipulate symbolic expressions. What they focus on is reasoning. The alternative is the biologically inspired approach, where the essence of intelligence is adapting the connection strengths of a large network of neuron-like processing elements. And what they focus on is learning and perception. These two different paradigms have completely different views about what internal representation should be like. In the logic-inspired approach, internal representations are symbolic expressions. They're like language, but a kind of cleaned-up language that's unambiguous. In the biologically inspired approach, internal representations are nothing at all like language. They're not symbolic expressions. They're big vectors of neural activity. So in the biologically inspired approach, the only place you get symbols is in the input and output. Inside, you have much richer representations that are big vectors. The two different paradigms also have completely different ways of making a computer do what you want. In the logic-inspired paradigm, you tell the computer what to do. It's intelligent design. You figure out consciously exactly how you would solve a problem, and then you tell the computer in excruciating detail how to do it. That's called programming. In the biologically inspired approach, it's quite different. You get a computer to do what you want by showing it examples of input and output, and having the computer learn how to map the inputs to the outputs. For this to work, you need a general purpose learning procedure that can cope with all sorts of different tasks. Of course, you have to program something. You have to program into the computer the general purpose learning procedure. A good example of an artificial intelligence task is to take an image and to produce a string of words that describes what's in the image. If you think about what an image really is, it's a very large number of pixels, each of which has red, green and blue values. And so you have to get from those numbers that represent the intensities of the pixels to a string of words that represents what's in the image. Figuring out a computer program to do that is very difficult. People in AI tried it for 50 years and failed. One problem is we don't know how we do it ourselves, and it seems very unlikely we do the vision by using logical reasoning. In the earliest days of AI, both the symbolic approach and the neural network approach had their adherents. In the 1950s, Alan Turing and John von Neumann were both proponents of the neural network approach, and they could hardly be accused of not understanding the symbolic approach. Unfortunately, both of them died young, Turing with some help from British intelligence. By the 1960s, mainline AI, which was the symbolic approach, was already dismissing the neural network approach as hopeless. There had been work around 1960 by Rosenblatt showing how you could get a simple learning algorithm to solve some fairly straightforward problems. But work by Minsky and Papert, published in 1969, showed that there were all sorts of problems that the simple learning algorithm couldn't deal with, And that led people in mainline AI to completely dismiss the neural network approach. They decided it was hopeless. The main issue was this. A neural network with many layers and nonlinear processing elements is an extremely powerful processing device. But the question is, could you get it to learn to solve a problem just by showing it examples of input and output? People who believed in neural nets thought that eventually they would be able to do that. People who believed in symbolic AI thought that that was a completely ridiculous hope. They dismissed it as pathetic wishful thinking, in much the same way as the geologists dismissed Wegener's theory of continental drift. If you had told a symbolic AI researcher in around 1980 that it would one day be possible to do reasonable quality translation from one language to another by using a large neural network that had no prior knowledge about linguistics and was simply trained on a big set of data of how to translate one sentence to another, they would have dismissed this idea as utterly ridiculous. The prevailing theory in linguistics in the 1980s was that language was not learned at all. Linguists thought that language was innate. That is, it evolved, but you didn't learn it during your lifetime. During your lifetime, your brain matured, and the linguistic knowledge that was innate revealed itself. From a practical standpoint, this is an absurd theory. This view of language came from Chomsky, and it was based on a bad application of a theorem. Gould's theorem showed that you could not learn a language perfectly every time from positive examples alone, and people took this to mean that you could not learn a language. As soon as you allow occasional mistakes and imperfections, the theorem no longer applies. There was something interesting happened here. A mathematical theorem was used to make people believe something that's manifestly absurd, which is that we don't learn language. I remember watching a TV program, I think it was a Nova program, quite a long time ago, where many leading linguists looked straight at the camera and said there's a lot we don't know about language, but one thing we know for sure is that it's not learned. That's the power of ideology. The whole idea that we evolved language because it's too difficult to learn in your lifetime is just silly. Learning algorithms that use gradient descent are a much more efficient way of adapting a large number of parameters than evolutionary algorithms. That's probably why evolution produced a brain, so the brain can learn things that are too difficult for evolution to evolve. I now want to talk a bit more about the nature of intuition. The kind of intuition that makes it just completely obvious that the Earth is rigid, or completely obvious that a neural network with 1 trillion parameters that start off with random values can't possibly learn everything from data. Where do these intuitions come from? Well, I think what deep learning has shown is that when you learn about a domain, you develop vector representations for things in the domain, and these vector representations have a very rich internal structure in terms of their features. As you become an expert, the internal structure of the vector representations makes some things just obvious. You don't need to do reasoning. They're just completely obvious given these vectors. So I'll give you an example. It's an example that's hard to explain using traditional logic. Suppose I tell you that you should ignore biology for the time being, and you have to assume either that all dogs are male and all cats are female, or that all dogs are female and all cats are male. Now I know it can't be like that, but if it had to be one way or the other, which would you choose? And at least in the culture I come from, it's obvious that dogs are male and cats are female. Now the question is, why is that obvious? It's based on an analogy, right? It's based on the idea that dogs are large and noisy and chase cats, whereas cats are smaller and more subtle. So the internal structure of the vector representations that we use to stand for things gives us immediate access to a bunch of obvious facts. What's happening is that if you look at the vector you use for men and the vector you use for women, there's a similarity between the vector for men and the vector for dogs, and a similarity between the vector for women and the vector for cats, at least in my culture. This is something that's This is a phenomenon that only occurs if we're using vector representations. You don't have to do any reasoning at all. It's just an automatic fact that because the vector for women is like the vector for cats, anything that the vector for women causes is likely to be caused by the vector for cats, or at least more likely to be caused by that vector than the vector for dogs. One of the nicest examples of deep learning developing intuitive understanding is the AlphaGo system. In that system, there are two neural nets that develop intuition. One can look at a board position and suggest sensible possible moves. The other can look at a board position and say how good it is for one of the players. Initially, they trained the neural net that predicted good moves by using training data taken from games by human experts. By having a net like this, which could intuitively suggest good moves, they were able to greatly cut down the search. That is, the process by which you say, if I go here and he goes there and I go here and he goes there, where do we end up? But later on, what they did was they trained the network for predicting what a good move might be from games that AlphaGo played against itself. And this is a really nice example of the interaction between intuition and reasoning. The neural network that suggests good moves, I'll call intuitive. It's just a pass through a neural network without any sequential reasoning. The process that says, if I go here and he goes there and I go here and he goes there, that's reasoning. That's considering various alternatives and seeing where you end up. Now the nice thing was that after you've considered some alternatives, you can use your evaluation function, the neural net that says how good is this position for me, to decide what really was a good move. So you get better information after some reasoning that can be used to refine your intuitions. I want to finish by showing you another paradox that's motivated a lot of my thinking about neural networks for the last few years. It's a very simple puzzle that I discovered once inside a Christmas cracker, and it's amazing how difficult people find it. And I think the extreme difficulty of the puzzle tells us a lot about how we represent shapes inside our brains. So it's a two-piece jigsaw puzzle. You take a tetrahedron, you cut it into two pieces, you give someone the two pieces, and all they have to do is assemble it back into a tetrahedron. It sounds completely trivial. Here's one of the pieces. It looks like this. Here's the other piece. It's exactly the same. And when you give people these two pieces, they try putting similar faces together. So they try that. That's not a tetrahedron. They try this. That's not a tetrahedron. They'll even consider trying this. That's not a tetrahedron. Then they try that again. No, that's still not a tetrahedron. Then they try that, and that's not a tetrahedron. And then often they give up and say it's impossible. So the question is, why is that such a difficult puzzle? Now, in case you're wondering what the answer is that. There, your tetrahedron. I've cut a tetrahedron in half in such a way you get a square cross section, which you probably didn't think you could get cutting a tetrahedron in half. Now, there's a completely different way of thinking about a tetrahedron. And if you think about the tetrahedron in this different way, the puzzle is easy. You can think about a tetrahedron as two lines at right angles, and now join all the points on this edge to all the points on this edge, and that's a solid tetrahedron. When you think about it that way, it's fairly obvious that if you cut it halfway up with a horizontal plane, you'll get a square cross section. But people don't think about tetrahedra like that, they think about them like this. When you think about a tetrahedron like this, You use a frame of reference in which the main axis is the vertical, so there's an apex at the top, and there's a triangular base. Now, if you see this, you think about this shape with an axis along the shape, along here, another axis across here, and another axis this way. So the natural rectangular coordinate system for this piece doesn't line up at all with the natural coordinate system you use for a tetrahedron. And that's why the puzzle is so hard. You can't see how this piece fits into a tetrahedron because you're using a different coordinate system for this piece. I actually got some experimental data on how hard this puzzle is. I tried it on a number of professors from an Institute of Technology, and what I discovered was the number of minutes it takes you to get the solution is roughly proportional to how many years you've been a professor there. The longer you've been there, the harder you find the puzzle. In fact, I have one professor who looked at the pieces, decided it couldn't be done, and after 10 minutes had a proof that it was impossible. Now, you'll probably be relieved to hear that the Institute of Technology where I did this experiment was in Massachusetts, not in India. I think the difficulty of the tetrahedron puzzle can only be explained by assuming that people represent shapes relative to intrinsic coordinate frames, and that if they use a different intrinsic coordinate frame for the same shape, they have a completely different internal representation. What's interesting about that is that's not the representation that's used by convolutional neural networks. So a standard convolutional neural network cannot explain why this puzzle is so difficult. It's much more like the representations that are used in computer graphics, and I think the future of computer vision is going to be making vision more like inverse graphics. That's all I have to say. Thank you for your attention.